So if you were looking for the thing that was supposed to be in this room, I just wanted to let you know what is in this room. And now is your opportunity to go find that other thing. And my name is Caylor. I live in Portland. I work for an organization called Partnership for Safety and Justice. But before we get started, I thought maybe each person on the panel could, say who they were and a really brief thing about them, and then maybe we can go into more of who we are and what we do in our talks.
I'm Tara Herivel, and I'm an editor and a public defender and a writer, and I live in Portland.
And you wrote Prison Profiteers.
Prison Profiteers, co-editing.
Hi, I'm Therese Saliba. I'm faculty of Third World Feminist Studies at the Evergreen State College. And the work I'm going to talk about is work I've done with the Arab American Community Coalition in Washington State on Arab and Muslim detention and immigrant detention.
And I'm Ruth Kovacs, and I'm here in Portland. I do Prison Pipeline on cable every Monday night at 6:30, and I write a column for Street Boots, which is called From the Desk of Ruth Kovacs, and it has a focus on prison issues. And thank you all for coming.
And then we have some people, this is being recorded for KBOO, our community radio station in Portland. We have it being videoed for internet distribution, and I don't know if people are doing that with question and answer. So I guess I just wanted to ask if there were people who didn't want to be videoed during question and answer time, and we should work that out. Anybody? I mean, you could also go stay in the back of the room, but I just want to make sure we had a way of working that out. Okay, so now we've done our brief introductions, and I want to learn a little bit about everyone who's in the room. So I have a few questions. Can I see hands for people who are working on a project connected to prisons or incarceration, or are somehow personally connected, or both, to prisons and incarceration issues? And then people working on issues of immigration and detention are connected to that in some way. Great. And who here is from Oregon? Washington? And other places? And those other places, just really quick? Ohio, wow.
California.
Colorado.
Anywhere else? Interesting, thank you. And so I mentioned briefly, I work for a nonprofit that is called Partnership for Safety and Justice. And we are a state-based organization that works on changing criminal justice policy. We work, we're kind of unique in the country. We work with people convicted of crimes, people surviving crime and violence, and the families of both. And our goal is to move policies forward in Oregon that redirect what we see as an over-expenditure on incarceration to policies that actually prevent crime and violence and support survivors of crime. Because we see that there's this huge trade-off between putting so much money into brick and mortar prisons and incarceration and basically everything else in the state, things that are good and life affirming. So my piece of the talk is to give a kind of overview of prison and incarceration issues. I'm going to talk specifically about Oregon, but if you're not from Oregon, think of it as a model for what's going on in your state, because the states are kind of dealing with incarceration right now in similar ways. And you're also welcome to ask me questions as we go along. We're going to have about 15 minutes for this, and to tell me to slow down, because I have a tendency to go and talk really fast. So first, anybody here know how many people are in prison and jail in the United States at this point? Just, yeah, how many?
About 2.5 million.
Yeah, it's 2.3 to 2.5 million people. That number, so the numbers I'm using, are not including people who are being detained because they are immigrants. So prison and jail numbers and statistics that you might see in the paper are not including the thousands and thousands of people who are in immigration detention, which is really prison. They call them detention centers, but they are prisons. They function in that way. So that's what these numbers are focused on. And that's a really big number. It's hard to wrap, trillions and billions of dollars going into different things, and it's a hard number to wrap your head around. So the Pew Center for the States broke it down in 2 different reports. So what that number means is 1 in every 100 people in the United States is in prison or jail. 1 in every 100. How many people are at this conference, right? And think about that. And that's a lot of people. And then they did a second report that came out this year, 2009, looking at the people in prison, jail, and under some form of criminal justice supervision, parole, probation, post-prison supervision. That's 1 in 31 people. We're the world's largest incarcerator. Like, we beat China, which has many more people, in putting people in prison in our country. So then who are these people? 2.5 million people. Primarily, incarceration impacts people of color most in this country. 1 out of every 11 African American men are affected by incarceration in some way. 1 out of every 11. That number is 1 out of every 45 for white men. That's how different the impacts of the system are on different people in our country. Women are the fastest growing part of our prison population. They're still a small segment, but we are incarcerating women at a much greater rate at this point than we're incarcerating men. That is connected to the drug war in a lot of ways. And then, this conference is about the intersections of environmental and economic crises. And I think it's kind of obvious, maybe not, where prisons and the economic crisis intersect, right? When we spend so much money on something like a prison, it has trade-offs. But before I get to those, I wanted to talk about how the economic crisis and the prison crisis intersect in individual lives. Because in my organization, we focus on not just prison policy, but policy connected to reentry, to people leaving prison. So people who are in prison at this moment are usually people are going to prison in their 18 to 30-something year range, which is when people are getting job skills, when people are going to college. And so we've taken a large part of our population, we've incarcerated them at that time when other people are getting skills and training and work experience. And it's also when people are incarcerated, they're not earning money to support their families on the outside. And then when you leave prison, your criminal record follows you. And so when you have a situation where we have, I think in Oregon, about 12% unemployment, if you're looking for work with a felony conviction on your record, you're much less likely than someone else to get those few jobs that come up. So it becomes a huge barrier that then when we talk about who's in prison, that prison affects communities of color to a much greater extent. Those communities are even more impacted by the economic crisis because those are communities where more people would have felony convictions that would inhibit them from finding work. So in Oregon, we recently had a report released called The State of Black Oregon, and one of the quotes from the report that I thought was really helpful in sort of understanding the economic crisis for Oregon's very small African American community was, in Oregon, the unemployment rate for the African American community has been at about 12% for a while now. And so when the economic crisis hit and everybody in the unemployment rate skyrocketed for the state, it affected that community to a much greater degree. So the quote that I thought was helpful was when the economy gets a cold, when Oregon's economy gets a cold, there's the quote, I'll pull it out of my head, the African American community gets pneumonia. And so part of that problem is connected to racism in the job market, racism in the prison industrial complex. And so that's sort of at the individual and community level. And then the prison industrial complex affects us at a state level, at a state budget crisis. As states across the country are engaged in trying to figure out how to stretch the few bits of tax dollars that they have to all the programs and services that need them. In Oregon, we had a $4 billion budget crisis this year. Anybody know how much we're spending on prisons for 2 years? We have 2-year budget cycles. We're spending $1.5 billion on prisons. So we had to figure out where we're going to cut, right? You got $4 billion hole in your budget. What are you going to cut? Just about every agency took cuts with the exception of corrections. Their budget was slightly lower than it should have been, but compared to higher education, compared to health and human services, the Department of Corrections came out pretty well. And I couldn't make my PowerPoint work. I had all these charts you could see, like, this was the 2007 budget, and this is how much it was cut for 2009. But just know that with a $1.5 billion budget, the Oregon Department of Corrections did very well in the last budget cycle.